So I've got one more short video here to tell you a little bit more about this idea of how much government, which we've been exploring. So again, governments are institutions that have this entire reach over our society, right? We see them as kind of this locus of control. It's where we have our debates and we hash out all of our disagreements. But government can also, as we saw in some previous discussions, reach into civil society and change some of the ways that common, rank and file citizens do their business, right? How you go about your day. And so some governments might have a very, very, very intensive or exhaustive reach into civil society, dictating many of the ways that people live their lives on a daily basis. One example might be a totalitarian government. And so I've included on here an image of these little, happy scouts who are walking around. Often if this were an in-person class, I'd say, hey, look at these, happy little scouts. They seem pretty innocuous, right? Until you realize that this is actually the Hitler Youth, which were in the 1930s, essentially an organization that trained young boys to essentially become, Nazi party supporters. The thing about the Hitler Youth, and of course I don't want to disparage the Boy Scouts of America, which is a very different organization, believe me. The thing about these individuals in the picture, right, is that they long ago, before the advent of this Hitler Youth sort of association, there was scouting in Germany, and it was not a fascist organization, right? It was just, again, like this innocuous sort of like these kids were learning how to tie knots and set up tents in the woods, right? This is an example of state essentially capture of a civil society organization. They took it over, the government did, and said, now essentially you're going to follow our rules. And so an example like the Boy Scouts of America, or your local church, or a nonprofit organization, or some a community, a farmer's market or something. These are all examples of institutions that do not exist as part of a formal government structure, right? So we can think about the federal government, the White House and the Supreme Court and all of these, major institutions that make up the federal government. Our state governments, Annapolis, Larry Hogan, all of the stuff happening over there. Our local governments, the Baltimore City Council, the mayor of Baltimore, the Baltimore County executive, Johnny Olszewski, all these people who are operating in formal government roles across our different strata of government. These institutions, these civil society institutions, are not part of that government. They're something that exists totally independently. They don't have formal offices. They don't connect into government that same way. However, in totalitarian governments, we'll see the civil society gets captured, and they no longer operate independently. So I think this is one thing that's important to take away from this discussion, is that in America, there is this sort of two-layer system where we've got government on one side and civil society on the other. People as far back as Alexis de Tocqueville, a sort of early French explorer through the lands of America, remarked that America is unique in the strength of its civil society. And one of the reasons why we are not, a totalitarian state like some of these others that we might discuss. This guy's been in the news. You may know him, you may not. It's Viktor Lukashenko. This is an individual who has been the president of Belarus for 20 plus years, and has been pressured recently to resign in a wave of sort of intense protests in Belarus for the first time. And so this is Lukashenko's Belarus is an example of a society where there is some degree of independence of civil society. You can have, a union organization. You can have some kind of club in Belarus that's not explicitly tied to the government. However, in authoritarian Belarus, there is no such thing as this, this arena where political interests can be debated, and where people can duke it out to just figure out who gets what. Right? In this case, the arena is dominated by just one team, and this is essentially what we might think of as an authoritarian regime. And so this group, they might have a very strong and influential government apparatus. There is some vestiges of civil society that still exist, but really the difference between this and a more open and more liberal kind of country, a democratic country, is that there's really one player who dominates that arena, the locus of power where government is contested. And finally, we might think about constitutional government. And here I have a very grainy image of something that you may or may not know exists, the Constitution of the State of Maryland. Yes, that's right. Our state has a constitution just as well as our country has a constitution. Constitutional governments essentially were created over the centuries with express limits on government power baked in, right? Things that carve out a space for civil society and set up the rules for fair contestation of different political forces in the arena of power that is government. And so, as we'll see not on Thursday, but another time, right? Maybe in our Thursday discussion, maybe later, constitutions are really mandates of responsiveness to citizens. This idea that government needs to be looking to its citizens and trying to react in ways that the citizens want. And so, one of the ways that happens is what we might call representative government, which is what we have, right? Where citizens get together and they choose agents, that is, politicians, to represent them in various seats of power. So in our constitutional government, we might have what we might call a limited government, because there are, compared to these other sort of models, limits on how much government can intercede into the world of civil society. So again, right, going back to our definition of institutions, the way that this Constitution functions really is that it sets up political institutions that do govern many of the ways that we behave in our daily lives, right? But again, they're not just big buildings, right? We're not just talking about the Supreme Court or Congress or whatever. We're talking about just a giant array of interlocking rules that shape political behavior. I think without knowing something specific about many of those rules, we're left with our heads spinning, I think, as citizens in a constitutional government like this. I think that's one of the foundational goals of this course, is to get you to really understand how all these institutions interact, the ways in which they function, and really where we play a role in responding, right? As this responsiveness is baked into our system, how we might be responsive and voice our opinions to government in a way that will be heard. So stay tuned for the next module. We're going to get much more into the institutions, specifically thinking about a kind of institution that's called a constitution that really lays the groundwork for all of the other things, right? The blueprint for our democracy.